All right, good morning, and we're starting our class. So, surprise, today is lesson 7. We've been talking about seeing God in the Old Testament, transition to Christ in the New Testament in terms of will, the prophecies that concern Jesus. So right now we're studying the 10 plagues and how they relate to ultimately the declaration that God is God, Jesus is God, the Holy Spirit is God, Christ is the blood of Christ sufficient for all, salvation through Christ is sufficient for all. We don't need false gods. We don't need other beliefs. We don't need other pathways. We need God. And so this week we're going to talk about the couple of the plagues, and we're going to call it the hail and the crops. So this is lesson 7 on the hail and the crops. First, though, today's trivia question is, since we're doing a birthday card for Benjamin, what was Benjamin's name when he was born? And the Benjamin in the Bible, not the Benjamin we're doing birthday cards for, because I don't know what his name was when he was born. I'm going to presume it was Benjamin, but I don't know that. However, I do know what Benjamin's name was when he was born. What was it? That is today's trivia question.
That's in the tribe of Benjamin?
Yes, the same Benjamin that is one of the 12 sons of Jacob. That Benjamin, the Benjamin you know from the Bible, the Benjamin who's primarily found in the Old Testament. There's a clue for you. And the Benjamin who was born back in the early days. What would we call the early days in the Bible? What book would encompass that? Probably Genesis. Yes, it's in. Yeah, Genesis is kind of early in the Bible. In fact, I'd say it's the first book, making it very early. So, Benjamin in Genesis, what was his name? Yes. Ben-Oni. Yes, we have two answers at once because I pointed vaguely. And so it's Ben-Oni. So let's look over at Genesis 35:16. Then they moved on from Bethel while they were still some distance from Ephrath. Rachel began to give birth and had great difficulty. As she was having great difficulty in childbirth, the midwife said to her, "Don't be afraid, for you have another son." As she breathed her last, for she was dying, she named her son Ben-Oni, or Ben-Oni, or Ben-Oni, whatever you want to pronounce it as. That's between you and the people you're talking to. But his father renamed him Benjamin. And as we discussed, that maybe it would more properly be pronounced Ben-Hamin because of the Hebrew term, although actually the Hebrews weren't well established yet at this point, but these were the earliest of Hebrews. But Benjamin Ben-Oni means son of my trouble. So you can imagine she named him that as she was dying because she was dying. That was trouble. And then Benjamin, as opposed to Ben-Oni, means son of the south. Notice too, I threw in every pronunciation already I can think of, but means son of the south probably, as opposed to the other sons of Jacob who were born in the northern part of the region of Israel, of what became Israel after the name Israel for Jacob. So anyway, he had a different name at birth. There were a few people. What we've discussed too over time is that there seems to always be a meaning behind why God would name someone that. And I think another, whatever their name is, another one that I think would make sense with Benjamin being the son of the south was that he was instrumental in the move to the south, to Egypt, in terms of the kingdom of God being established there for 430 years and then becoming the nation of in Canaan as Israel. So just a little side note since we're doing those birthday cards. How are the birthday cards coming along?
They're right back here.
Oh, good. They're moving. Good.
Yes.
We don't want birthday cards to sit on chairs because that's inherently boring. All right, so today we're going to talk about a couple of different false gods of Egypt again. And I want to just clarify, because I think it's fair, the reasoning behind all this in terms of why the plagues were against the false gods. And it's the clear answer that I try to give each week is that the Israelites needed to reestablish their belief in Jehovah God as the one true God, and the Egyptians needed to become aware of Jehovah God, that he is the one true God, and that all of their false worship was not powerful compared to Jehovah God, the one true God. So all the plagues seem to be pointed very directly against the false god, and you can look at the history, not only in scripture, but in history, about how that is true. So I just want to point out, because it's a challenging thing to me at least, to talk about false god, because I actually think these are real false gods in terms of, and even then I can't really think of the way to say it. I think there is power behind, like for instance, ISIS and some of these that were worshipped. I think it is a demonic power. I think it's from Satan. I think if we undermine the fact that some of these evil minions, if you want to put it that way, or some in the dominion of Satan, if we undermine the idea that they have power, we also fail to realize that we need to be careful to avoid them. I think there's a reason that God said, as he had the people going into Canaan, that I want you to drive out every tribe, nation, group in Israel, because I don't want you to get mixed up with them in marriage and begin to worship their gods. It wasn't that those gods just were sort of figures of somebody's imagination. It wasn't that there was no danger in serving one for a while if you just kind of felt on a whim that you wanted to. It's that there is a real power there and a real danger in getting caught up in that spiritual warfare. So I think it's very important to realize that these were not flippant, these weren't like little cartoon caricatures or characters, either one, that the Egyptians talked about and sort of tried to explain away. Oh, a hailstorm came because, this little character. This was real worship of real, but not gods. And I believe the statement that God is the one true God is because there are other gods that exist in the spiritual realm. It's something we just don't understand well. So for instance, when I read in Daniel that the Archangel Michael was tied up for 3 weeks with the Prince of Persia in a battle, when Daniel was praying for Michael to come and rescue him, then I think that's a real power. I don't think that the Archangel Michael took out a comic book, for instance, and said, oh, there's the Prince of Persia, I'm just going to spend 3 weeks, in delay. There was an actual spiritual battle, and that's what we're talking about with these plagues. It was more than just, you think in your mind that there's, the goddess of fertility, so the plague against the frogs is coming on you to show that only God is really powerful. It's not to say there is no power and dominion in that spiritual realm. I hope that makes sense. So the next one we're going to study is, of course, very appropriately named Nut. And so in UT, we'll call him Newt or Nut. I don't care what you call him in terms of pronunciation. But this, we finished last week on Isis, the sixth plague, the sixth personage of a goddess there. And I just want to remind us that Exodus 9, make sure I'm in the right book. Yes, Exodus 9, or the right chapter. Exodus 9 verse 11, the magicians could not stand before Moses because the boils that were on them, and on all the Egyptians. So these boils were very significant. I think we talked about that enough last week. But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he would not listen to Moses and Aaron, just as the Lord had said to Moses. So this week we're going to talk about the plague of hail. And sure enough, the god Nut, N-U-T, or Newt, whichever, was the female, this is a female, the goddess of the sky and the goddess of hail, which I think is a very interesting deal. And the reason, of course, thinking about where Egypt is, Egypt has a long border along the sea, the Mediterranean Sea, has a long river going through the middle, mostly very flat, mountainous region over toward the Red Sea on the eastern side, a mountainous region over toward Libya on the western side, which On the other side of that is the Sahara Desert. So when you have a narrow channel, relatively narrow, a few hundred miles, between mountains, and you have a sea coast and you have dry air, and that dry air comes and hits the air mass from the sea, you can have a hailstorm. That's why we have hailstorms at times, usually spring and fall. Anybody who lives in Wiley can tell us that there are different times of year too. You have terrible hailstorm, but that's the aberration, not the rule. And so usually in the spring and fall, there can be a hailstorm because of the way the cold air hits the hot air, and with the precipitation coming from the sea, it freezes quickly. Rather than shedding as rain, it comes down as hail. And so they actually had the worship of the goddess of hail, because that hail came in spring and fall. What was happening in the spring but the harvesting of their crops for the year. So if you planted a wheat type product like wheat, barley, oats, spelt is one that is sort of a cheaper but easier to grow in dry conditions grain that's been found in a number of Egyptian tombs. They're full of the grain heads of spelt. And that's again kind of like a lower grade wheat, but it's very useful to feed the masses. And so this was at the time of the harvest of that product. And so if hail came and destroyed that product in the field, then their food for the year was in jeopardy. Okay, so that's the timing and the reasoning why it was important to the people to try to worship the goddess of the sky and the storm and the hail, to ward off, presumably, that hail until after the produce could be harvested. All right, let's read then Exodus 9:13. Exodus 9:13. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Get up early in the morning, confront Pharaoh, and say to him, this is what the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, says, let my people go, so that they may worship me. Or this time I will send the full force of my plagues against you and against your officials and your people, so you may know there's no one like me in all the earth." Okay, let's think about that statement. The full force of a plague. You already have water turned into blood, frogs everywhere in the bed, in the kneading trough, in the oven, piles of frogs sinking up the land. All of a sudden I'm drawing a blank on the third. The earth turned into the mites, the dust turning into mites or lice or chiggers or whatever you want to think of that way, something annoying that drilled into their skin and made a mess of things. The flies came on the land just as the people had sores all over them, and then the livestock was hit by the plague against the livestock in the field. And then, of course, last week was Isis with the boils and sores, the goddess of health and peace, hit the body with boils and sores. And now God tells Aaron, or Moses through Aaron, to say, this time I will send the full force of my plagues against you. What else could happen? And we know the answer to that, of course, but I think he will have wondered. For by now, verse 15, I could have stretched out my hand and struck you and your people with the plague that would have wiped you off the earth. But I have raised you up for this very purpose, that I might show you my power, and that my name will be proclaimed in all the earth. You still set yourself against my people and will not let them go. Therefore, at this time tomorrow, again, a very precise prediction as to the plague, at this time tomorrow I will send on you the worst hailstorm that has ever fallen on Egypt, from the day it was founded till now. Give an order now to bring in your livestock and everything you have in the field to a place of shelter, because the hail will fall on every man and animal that has not been brought in and is still out in the field, and they will die. So this is going to be a terrible hailstorm. And I know, we hear things about bad hailstorms. We hear a roof needs to be replaced, a window breaks, maybe somebody's out and has a bruise. I would suspect none of you know someone who has died in a hailstorm. Is that true? I don't think any of us have a very good accounting of how many people even die in a hailstorm per year. But I can tell you it's very minuscule, because most of the time, while hail is very uncomfortable, it's not killer hail. And this is, he is saying, you will have the worst hailstorm ever, and it will kill you if you're out in the field. Those officials of Pharaoh, verse 20, who feared the word of the Lord, hurried to bring their slaves and their livestock inside. But those who ignored the word of the Lord left their slaves and livestock in the field. Then the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand toward the sky, so that hail will fall all over Egypt, on men and animals, and on everything growing in the fields of Egypt. When Moses stretched out his staff toward the sky, the Lord sent thunder and hail, and lightning flashed down to the ground. So the Lord rained hail in the land of Egypt. Hail fell, and lightning flashed back and forth. It was the worst storm in all the land of Egypt since it had become a nation. Throughout Egypt, hail struck everything in the fields, both men and animals. It beat down everything growing in the fields and stripped every tree. The only place it did not hail was the land of Goshen, where the Israelites were. We'll stop there for a second. So thinking about that, now I thought when I was a kid that this was hail and fire. And the reason I thought that probably was the documentary, The Ten Commandments, that showed it as fire on the ground, you know, when if you saw the show. And so I think, though, it's actually a more frightening thing to think about lightning being so powerful during this, to where you could be struck. You know, if you just simply only had hail falling on the ground and some little fire, which is how it's portrayed, that's a little different than lightning bolts everywhere, zapping out, you know, people's lives, animals' lives, the lives of the slaves there, the people who happen to be slaves. So this also speaks to, just to answer before it's asked, maybe, that there were other slaves in Egypt that other than the Israelites. Egypt was at this time the most powerful nation in the world and had dominion over the rest of the world. And there was a large collection of slaves there, much like in the Roman Empire later. And so there was it was a time of many different peoples in Egypt, which maybe led somewhat to some of the false gods being more significant than others in terms of the worship to them. It is probably mostly Egyptian, but there were others. And then, of course, the land of Goshen is where the Israelites were by now sequestered for the most part. So, any questions on that so far? And then I'll get to the next significant section. No? Okay. That's a shame, because I need a little sip of coffee, so I'll just go ahead and take one. But I tell you, low on antioxidants, talking about death in the field from hail and lightning is rough. But not as rough as being out there in it. So, verse 27. Then Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron. This time I have sinned, he said to him. The Lord is in the right, and I and my people are in the wrong. Pray to the Lord, for we have had enough thunder and hail. I will let you go. You don't have to say any longer. So I think this is really fascinating theologically. For one thing, what is sin? If we just define sin as simple sentence.
Separation from God.
Yeah, separation from God. I think that's the best, most concise definition of sin, is separation from God. So what Pharaoh said was, I am separated from your God. And I think that is really a fascinating realization that God's in charge. Because, and we're not quite there yet, and I don't want to spoil it all, but on the 10th plague we'll discuss that Pharaoh himself was considered a god in Egypt. So what he was saying is, I, as the God of Egypt, have sinned or separated from your God, and I need you to pray for me. Remember with the other plagues, he wanted them stopped. He said, have them stop. But he really didn't say, you know, I'm separated from your God. Fully acknowledging that God's in charge, really, is what happened here. And that I need prayers for it to stop, for you to pray for it to stop. I just find that rather fascinating in terms of the progression of theological realization that Jehovah God is the one true God. So, verse 29, Moses replied, when I've gone out of the city, I will spread out my hands in prayer to the Lord. The thunder will stop, and there will be no more hail, so that you may know that the earth is the Lord's. but I know that you and your officials still do not fear the Lord. So that was kind of interesting too, because Moses kind of was able to call him out on that and say, you're saying this really out of convenience, and it will stop, but you've got to realize that God is God. So, and then this speaks of the time of year, verse 31, the flax and the barley were destroyed, since the barley had headed and the flax was in bloom. The wheat and the spelt, however, were not destroyed because they ripened later. Then Moses left Pharaoh, went out of the city. He spread out his hands toward the Lord. The thunder and hail stopped, and the rain no longer poured down on the land. When Pharaoh saw that the rain, hail, and thunder had stopped, he sinned again. He and his officials hardened their hearts. So Pharaoh's heart was hard, and he had not let the Israelites go, just as the Lord had said through Moses. So, I think, again, this kind of raises that issue that in my mind at least comes up, is how much was Pharaoh culpable? And I think it's interesting, Pharaoh was beginning to acknowledge that God is God, but he still had not diminished himself as a God comparable to Jehovah God, and of course he's not. So I think that was the difference there in the hardening of his heart. Yes? Yeah, he was lying.
If you really believe that God and he was separated from
Yeah.
you wouldn't lie.
Absolutely. So her comment is, it's obvious he really didn't fully acknowledge that Jehovah God is God, because he lied about his plans. He really was manipulative, I think would be a fair term. He was trying to manipulate the idea that, oh yeah, I now I trust God, pray. And it's interesting because I found at times in life, I've both been the one to ask for prayers for something, or the one to be asked to pray for something that frankly, I'm not really sure the person even has the faith idea of, but it's a convenient thing to say to pray. And I think that's a real challenge. Like for instance, let's say if I knew of somebody who was meeting with me to tell me about how awful their wife is so that they could leave them and divorce them, and how horrible she had always been, how they had never been in love, never been meant to be whatever. And I know all those things are a lie, because at some point Satan can interfere in a relationship and cause those things to seem true, but they can't be true. That if you have married somebody and raised kids with them, you are not, oh, this never was meant to be. It's all right now, I want something else. That's what it boils down to, is the selfishness. So let's say in that spot, maybe I've, been asked to pray, help this divorce succeed. I can't pray that. It's interesting because that's a go-to for people to look real righteous when they know very well they're involved in a sin. And I think it's sad. It's tragic spiritually that that's the view, that they can try to manipulate God into the circumstance and make it seem right, when we know it's not right. And this strikes me, and that's what Pharaoh is doing here, was trying to manipulate the circumstance so that it sounded like, Pharaoh's trained really well to God. And he did mention, he said, the Lord is in the right, I and my people are in the wrong. That's a start, no doubt. Pray to the Lord, for we have had enough thunder and hail. And I think that may be the key issue, is he wanted to pray about how they wanted the thunder and hail to go. He didn't want to pray about, I need a change of heart. And I think that's very similar to our circumstances, people, where we want something specific to happen, but we don't necessarily yield to what the will of God is in that specific circumstance. And I think, it's important for us to pray for events in life. I think if you're looking for a job, it's great to pray for the right job to be presented to you, to be the right employee in the job situation that you do end up in. I find it a little tough to pray for a specific job because, you'll bring what I want in that job. That's always a challenge to me, to have somebody come and say, would you pray that I get this job because, I really want that job. And I think, well, I'm very glad that somebody really wants and is pursuing something they really want, but I'm not real sure it's a spiritual issue that way. Yeah, I hope that makes sense. But I think it's really a challenging thing. It's kind of like, so many events in our lives. If we yield to the will of God, we may find ourselves in a very different circumstance than what we plan out for ourselves. And I think that's why so many people's plans never are fulfilled. And I hear that from people too, where they say, well, I had always wanted to do whatever, and here I am just doing this instead. I think, well, see how God is using you in that spot where you are instead. I really doubt any of the Israelites have been praying fervently that they could remain slaves in Egypt, although there were certainly little doubts thrown in during the time of the Exodus from Egypt. But I think all in all, if they looked at the big picture blessing of what God had in mind for them, they would feel very differently about that. I'm going to read a little bit of the plague of the locusts, because it's kind of a similar deal. So, chapter 10. Exodus 10:1. Then the Lord said to Moses, go to Pharaoh, for I've hardened his heart and the hearts of his officials, so that I may perform these miraculous signs of mine among them, that you may tell your children and grandchildren how I dealt harshly with the Egyptians, and how I performed my signs among them, and that you may know that I am the Lord. It's the first time God really spoke to more than just the leaders of Egypt in terms of this is the big picture. This is a plague coming. Pharaoh and his officials have hardened hearts. You can tell your kids and grandkids how great God, Jehovah God is because of this dominance. So the God on this one is the God Seth, S-E-T-H, not to be confused with the third child of Adam and Eve. But the God Seth in Egypt was the God of storm and disorder. And, you might think, well, we just had the storm of the hail with the lightning and too much of it. But then he's going to bring in the locusts here, which really speaks to the disorder. And if we touched on locusts a little bit a couple weeks ago. When they come in large numbers. They get everywhere, they make noise, they annoy everybody, they chew up everything. And a group of locusts can consume a field very quickly. You may not see that much now because we're probably not largely agriculturally based here. But my understanding is that if you have a big ear locust that come every 17 years like on the East Coast, that they can consume 40 acres of a crop in about a day. And if you think about that, that's a lot of locusts, that's a lot of chewing, and that's a lot of crop going away because those locusts came and ate it. So think about that in terms of what is going to happen here. So Moses there in verse 3 went to Pharaoh and said, this is what the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, says. How long will you refuse to humble yourself before me? Speaking to what she was saying about not really believing in God, though saying it. Humble yourself before me. Let my people go, so that they may worship me. If you refuse, let them go. I'll bring locusts into your country tomorrow. They will cover the face of the ground so that it cannot be seen. They will devour what little you have left after the hail, including every tree that is growing in your fields. They'll fill your houses and those of all your officials and all the Egyptians, something neither you, your fathers, nor your forefathers have ever seen from the day they settled in this land till now. Then Moses turned and left Pharaoh. So I'm going to stop there this week in the interest of time. We'll pick up there from the locusts. But again, keep in mind, this would strike fear in the Egyptians because they relied on these crops all year. We know the story very well of the dreams that Pharaoh had that Joseph interpreted, and he stored up grain for 7 extra years because the plague was coming. This was not, a time where you could just go down somewhere and buy other food. This was their food for the year that was being jeopardized. And, in large part, they had other crops, but this was the bulk of the grain crop that would provide, bread and the base of food for them for the year. So very significant in terms of the way it would strike the people. And I think it's interesting, we do forget, I think, that we don't always just have food readily available, because we do. I mean, it's shocking how much food we get to within minutes. And, you know, I think it's just a reminder of how reliant the people were on the land, but therefore how reliant they should be on Jehovah God. And that speaks volumes to us as well. Thank you for listening and all the comments, and we will pick up there next week in the plague of the locusts. I'll be at verse 7. We'll of course start it again because we do that to get the context. But we'll be wrapping up the plagues likely in the next 2 weeks. Actually, next week we have a guest speaker, and in 2 weeks we'll start here at the locusts. So, very good. Thank you much.